Psychologists of Reddit. What's the most interesting mental disorder you've encountered? Medical doctor here, neurologist. Kugra delusion. The patient is convinced that a family member has been replaced by an imposter who is completely identical. For example, the patient will tell you the person sitting across from them looks exactly like their spouse, sounds exactly like their spouse, has all the memories of their spouse, but that's not actually their spouse. And the patient oftentimes isn't overly distressed by this imposter. In 20 years, I've only seen the condition twice. Story 2. I once worked with a guy whose voices were positive like a cheer squad. So instead of, "You're useless, no one likes you," his voices said, "You look amazing today. People think you're charming and funny." It wasn't great, though. He has enough insight to understand that they were as much a hallucination as if they were giving negative messages. And he felt this crushing, overwhelming pressure that he couldn't live up to the incredibly high standards of his voices. It was quite crippling for him, really. As much as, if not more so than if the voices were negative or even benign. The whole voices in your head thing when it's a hallucination changes by culture, I believe. Like, from my understanding, in Western cultures, it tends to be more those depressive sort of negative voices, but then in other cultures, they're just fine, chill, and they're vibing. It's interesting this guy was getting really positive messages that were still kind of tormenting him. I wonder what was going on in his head to make that the case. Story 3. Mental health counselor here. The interesting one is schizophrenia with visual hallucinations. Most people with schizophrenia have auditory hallucinations. I did not realize how much more unsettling the visual one is. The client I had with this disorder used to see me and other people he knew. He called me up once, yelling at me for coming into his apartment early in the morning. Even if I told him otherwise, the experience of seeing me is very real to him. I can't imagine seeing people in my own home, especially at night. That would freak me the hell out. Story 4. Early on in my career, I worked at a planned community that functioned as a partial hospitalization program. One of the residents would bring magazines and newspapers he'd found to the main office door every day. Sometimes he'd be upset, sometimes overjoyed, depending on the stories, because all of them were about him. I've never worked with someone with such delusions before or since. One day he was Michael Jordan offering to buy us cars. The next he was Osama bin Laden trying to hide with us. He'd read his obituary, his wife cheated on him in a political scandal, he'd surveyed the Congo. We restricted and sorted his mail after the bin Laden incident, but he'd find other residences, or in the community. Story 5. Phantom pregnancies are pretty fascinating. A woman can be so convinced that she's pregnant that her periods stop. She'll get all the classic symptoms, and her belly might even grow. Nobody is sure how this happens. Also, share psychosis is pretty crazy. There was a case a few years ago where twin sisters visited each other. One was mentally ill and the other was not. The ill one went into a psychotic state, and the healthy twin suddenly, for no reason, went into the same psychotic state. They threw themselves into traffic multiple times, getting hit by trucks. After being separated at the hospital, the healthy twin snapped out of her psychosis and was fine. The other one, however, stayed in it, ending up ending someone with a hammer, and neither of them remembered anything that happened. Story 6. Medical doctor here. Not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but I did encounter a pretty interesting patient case on my psychiatry rotation when I was in med school. There was a patient at an inpatient psychiatry facility for ideation. During her admission, she constantly insisted she had a mass on her breasts, demanding to be physically examined only by male doctors. When the psychiatrist I was rotating under declined to perform a physical exam, she asked me to do it during my daily patient interview. I also declined physical exam, but had a bit of a hunch to check her medical records. It turned out she had an ultrasound done a week before that, and it found only normal breast tissue without masses. However, apparently this lady had frequented many doctors' offices with various complaints of an unspecific nature, usually focusing on private complaints, and she visited male physicians' offices. The psychiatrist I was working with diagnosed her with facetious disorder, formerly known as Munchausen syndrome, and also felt she had a personality disorder. He felt it was histrionic personality disorder, but also felt it was possibly borderline personality disorder. Definitely cluster B, though. It seems her goal was mostly attention for medical professionals. She had lots of issues, but we also had to be careful to make sure she wasn't fishing for a lawsuit. Patients like her why doctors document everything meticulously, so the patient wouldn't admit to making things up all the time. According to the psychiatrist I was working with, she didn't actually believe any of her health problems existed, and her primary goal was the attention for medical professionals. If she actually believed she was sick, we would have diagnosed her with illness anxiety disorder, commonly known as hypochondria. Story 7. Doctor training to be a psychiatrist here. Had a patient recently who was convinced he had fathered a child he hadn't. He got in trouble because he would go to the kid's school to try to contact him. Parents were understandably upset, and had never had any contact with the patient previously. patient believed that Stephen Hawking had inseminated the mother with his, the patient's, seed by some sort of telepathic process he couldn't explain. Truly bizarre, and so far hasn't really gained insight with treatment. He gets very emotional thinking about his son. Still works full-time though, and in many respects leads a normal life. Amazing. I can't fathom the mental distress this disorder would cause. Like, whatever is actually going on in his head, what he believes is that he has a son who he has no contact with and people don't want him to contact him. And to live that reality is just brutal, man. Or at least I would assume it hasn't happened to me. I hope with psychiatric help he figures stuff out, and he doesn't have to live his whole life believing this. Story 8. Psychiatrist here who's worked in high-secure settings. I've dealt with serial murderers, cannibals, assaulters, etc. But one of the cases that stands out to me the most is an OCD case from training. For those unaware, OCD has various forms. This man was suffering from frisky OCD, where the thoughts were of an intimate nature. The two most common forms are incest and thoughts of children. Now, to be clear, these people have no desire towards their relatives or children, but are plagued by constant distressing thoughts of doing so, closer to memories, actually, than thoughts. So this man had thoughts of children in his OCD, and had been admitted after his daughter called the police. He had been holed up in his room for months, refusing to come out, refusing to talk to people, and utterly disgusted at himself. When the police came to take him, he assumed that they knew about it, and went with them. His daughter, an adult herself, asked to give him a hug as he left. He refused, citing that he couldn't bear to touch her. When I admitted, the review was one of the oddest I've had. IT was essentially an hour-and-a-half review where he said nothing. The thoughts of what he had done were so abhorrent to him that he couldn't fundamentally bring himself to talk about it, but he desperately wanted to. So anytime I tried to end the session, he grappled with coming up with a reason for me to stay. Desperate to tell me about these thoughts, but unable to verbalize them, as that would make them real. Instead, he continued to talk around the topic, leaving out important words like children or anything to do with banging, or sitting in silence until I tried to leave and begging me to stay. It transpired he'd been racking his mind to try and place these images of abusing children with times in his life, believing he had blacked out and committed atrocious acts on his daughter's friends, and now these memories were resurfacing. This case taught me a lot about treating psych patients, but one of the oddest points was that he was one of the 3 male patients all admitted with the same thing at that time. This is far more common than people realize. IT is also part of the reason I frequently point out to people that the whole hang the kid touchers stance is actually counterproductive, and leads to far more harm than saving kids. I don't know what IT stands for in this story, by the way. I looked it up and everything, and I couldn't really find anything searching IT psychology or IT therapy or anything like that, because I assume it's some kind of therapy or like an interview session. I don't know. If you do know, throw it in the comments, because I have no idea. On the note of the story, though, this is a terrible thing to be haunted by. Thoughts of doing things that you know are horrific and you have no control at all over them. That's terrifying stuff, man. People talk about intrusive thoughts all the time or whatever. No, these are real intrusive thoughts. And I really hope this guy doesn't have to live with them for the rest of his life. Story 9. Pain conversion disorder. I had an ex-girlfriend that was in a wheelchair. Her parents said she may have woken up during a surgery she had when she was a kid, because it all started after that surgery. She even went to physical therapy for it for years, and she might still go. That I don't know. But she could move around without the chair, kind of, but she couldn't walk. So it was almost a disability, but not fully. Very confusing. She was the coolest girl I ever dated, though. Story 10. Dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder. I'm not a psychologist, but I used to be an assistant to a school social worker. We worked very closely together, so I pretty much saw everything she saw. We worked with kids who had emotional issues. Some had trauma issues. One girl came to us in the 9th grade. She lived with her grandmother and father at the time. Her mother and her stepfather repeatedly assaulted her as a very, very young child, and went to jail when she was about 5. She has no recollection. Whenever she experiences confrontation, fear, stress, conflict, she acts differently instantly. Sometimes she would crawl under her desk and hiss and bark. Sometimes she would run around the room and giggle and skip and squeal. Sometimes she would squint her eyes and make weird noises. When the social worker got in contact with her therapist, don't worry, a waiver is signed for their information to be shared, she also informed her of the various names and identities of her other personalities. Basically, the girl transforms into other people when she's scared because it helps her escape the reality, which was once too horrific to bear. She has no clue that she does this, and often reports she has memory issues. She was one of my favorite students to work with. I remember the first day I met her, she was sobbing and ripping up papers because she didn't want to be there. On my last day, we were joking around and drawing pictures together. I wish nothing but the best for her. Story 11. Not the most interesting disorder, but interesting in prevalence is GAD. About 40% of men and 50% of women suffer from it in my office. The Western ideals of hard work, keeping up, pulling non-existent bootstraps is mentally harming everyone. It's a serious frickin' problem that the government and/or big pharma like to profit from. It's interesting because it's so disgusting. Humans are not designed to be pulled in 30 different directions, but that's what modern society expects. And it's destroying us all. GAD is generalized anxiety disorder, just in case you didn't pick that up. And yeah, anxiety is very commonly diagnosed now. It's hard to say if it's overdiagnosed or if the situations of the world have led themselves to that being the case, where just everyone is anxious about things all the time because life is so stressful. I think it's probably a little of both personally, but I'm no expert. Either way, though, a bunch of people getting diagnosed with it is not great. Story 12. I'm a licensed psychologist now, but before I went to grad school, I worked at an inpatient mental health hospital on adult and adolescent units. I would say the most interesting two disorders I've seen are dissociative fugue and conversion disorder. I saw both while I was there. Dissociative fugue is a condition where someone can wake up one day and believe they're a different person for a short amount of time. My experience was a man who woke up and drove his car from his home until it ran out of gas, which happened to be in my city. He had no identification with him and didn't remember his name. He also didn't remember any family or any details of his life. After a short stay in the hospital and some medication, he remembered everything, and had a family member pick him up and monitor him for a while, but he still had to put gas in the car, which had been towed to the hospital parking lot. Conversion disorder is characterized by the individual losing the ability to do something, for example, walking, seeing, or talking, and believing it has a biological component. In reality, it's a response to significant trauma and is dissociative in nature. A woman in the hospital manifested the symptom of losing her ability to walk while she was in the hospital. There was no reason as to why she wasn't able to walk. She came in walking, was unable to ambulate while there, and left walking again. Story 13. I worked as a counselor in corrections. ICE, the drug, induced psychosis. It's as scary as it sounds. I saw several clients' mental health decline rapidly due to drug use. Some develop paranoia, hallucinations, or unpredictable behavior. When ICE swept through the city I worked in, the downward spiral of some of my clients was devastating. A man I had worked with for over a year went from being sober and reconnecting with his children to being certain that the feds were out to get him. His demeanor completely changed after his use of the drug, and he was impossible to understand, incoherent, and he was even violent while sober. It's like the drug just broke his brain. He was such a sweet man prior to it, and I think he had a shot at a real future. Unfortunately, he took his own life while high. Story 15. Delusional disorder is super interesting to me. I've seen people who present as high-functional and well-educated. You would have no idea they're suffering from such a condition without speaking to them, because delusional disorder doesn't involve the behavioral abnormalities or hallucinations that schizophrenia and other psychoses do. There may be minor ones, but they're consistent with delusions. A conversation can start out very normal, then all of a sudden it's government mind control and alien invasions. It's really hard to keep composure if you don't know they suffer from this beforehand, because it just comes out of nowhere. Edit. I don't want to downplay how serious of a condition this is. People can have their lives completely ruined because they have a difficult time seeking help. Also, the lack of other symptoms make the condition much easier to overlook, meaning the individual is less likely to be encouraged to seek help. Story 16. I'm not in healthcare, but when I was in college, my ex-girlfriend worked at a group home for folks with things like severe BPD, etc. Some of the residents also had issues like Downs. The issues sort of ran the gamut. One of the residents was a woman who chronically pleasured herself. I never knew this was a thing, and I'm happy to report I never experienced it since. But this lady would just start doing it anywhere, everywhere, under just about any circumstance. Don't think she even really got pleasure out of it. It was more just a compulsion of some kind. Either way, it's jarring to see a person who is engaged in otherwise normal activities just start rubbing one out of nowhere on you at random. Story 17. Doctor but not a psychologist. When I was interning in psych wards, I came across a patient who believed she was recruited by George Bush to find Osama. She claimed she was working on computer codes that would find Laden. She did have a notebook, those double-lined ones that are given to kids to practice the alphabet. In it were pages and pages of random numbers and symbols written with different colored pens. She was a middle school math teacher living in a village of a developing country. Story 18. Social worker here. Had a kid who had a lot of indicators for being a psychopath. According to 2 psychiatrists and the psychologist I was working with at the time, I've dealt with a lot of aggressive clients who tried to attack me and told me they would end me or stab me. He's the only one I ever felt like he actually meant it. The only thing that was stopping him was him being 6, and me being able to grab him and hold him if he were to try and grab a knife. I am still convinced this is a boy who in 10 years will be in jail for murdering someone. One time he was eating some bread and he took his butter knife, looked at me and started stabbing his bread, and he told me he would stab me in my privates next. Very intriguing to see that behavior on a 6-year-old. This kid had some stuff going on. Like, I refuse to believe a kid can just pop out like this. Something terrible happened to this guy, and I hope that he can work through it as life goes on. Story 19. Cotard's delusion. Often an associated symptom of severe dissociative depression. Cotard's delusion is the belief that one has died, and is either a reanimated/zombified bodily husk of their former self, or that they have died and the events of the present are taking place in some sort of afterlife. People with Cotards sometimes report that they can feel their internal organs shutting down or rotting, and no longer have a need for sustenance, sleep, or bodily care, which of course exacerbates the illness. It's extremely rare, but I did once meet a person in a non-clinical setting that told me at the worst point of their depression, they'd stopped eating and sleeping properly because they dissociated so thoroughly from their body that they no longer registered as having one at all, and would feel confused or startled when people, the living, would acknowledge them in public. They didn't have any solid support systems at the time, so the delusion was also born from social isolation. One can go weeks without proper human interaction, which edifies the belief that one is dead or invisible to the world. Personally, I think this speaks to the perils of a profoundly disconnected society that no longer values or prioritizes community and human bonds. But that's a rant for another time. I mean, this makes complete sense to me. Humans, by nature, are very social creatures. In any sort of isolation, this can be found in, like, solitary confinement too. People just kind of lose it, and that's sort of to be expected. I don't think it's a stretch to say that a part of our experience as people is in relation to other people. Take that away, and things go nuts. Story 20. Has anyone ever heard of disorganized schizophrenia or hebephrenia? I was diagnosed with it when I was 19. Here are some symptoms. Recently, the DSM got rid of the diagnosis and made it a single umbrella of just schizophrenia. I feel like I kind of got robbed in the sense that I don't hallucinate much. I mostly just can't think straight when it gets real bad. Here are the symptoms below. Loose associations, rapidly shifting between topics with no connections between them. Perseveration, repeating the same things over and over again. Made-up words that only have meaning to the speaker. Use of rhyming words without meaning. When cognitive disorganization is severe, it can be nearly impossible to understand what the person is saying. A decline in overall daily functioning. Unpredictable or inappropriate emotional responses. Lack of impulse control. And behaviors that appear bizarre or lack purpose. Now, before I say this, I want to let you know I do take mental health seriously. That being said, after like the first 4 symptoms were listed, I was kind of like, that sounds like Dr. Seuss to me. And I'm not ragging on the condition or anything, but like, hear me out. The made-up words that only have meaning to the speaker and use of rhyming words without meaning, is that not just like straight up Dr. Seuss? Anyway, I hope I didn't offend anyone just now, but I had to say it. Story 21. I used to work in an inpatient psych unit and spent some time doing case management. I still think about one case in particular sometimes. Older lady, 30 plus years of ice use under her belt, chronically homeless, and a long history of abuse-related trauma. She had a deep, almost religious love for Jackson Browne. She said they had met at a concert of his when she was a teenager, and they had this big, sweeping love affair for years. That may or may not have actually happened, but she had a strong belief that he watched over her always, and that he wrote several songs for her, and beamed them to her YouTube app on her phone to send her messages. She also thought that he was a shapeshifter that once appeared to her as a grizzled old cowboy. She just up and disappeared one day, never saw or heard from her again, but I do still think about her sometimes. She's lived a hard life and endured more than anyone should ever have to, wherever she is. I sincerely hope she's doing alright. Story 22. Working in the ER, I got to see many weird/odd behaviors. One was mass hysteria. A local 14-year-old was murdered and his community all turned out for the funeral. During the funeral service, a family member had a pseudo-seizure that left her unconscious. Before the EMTs arrived, the pseudo-seizures, followed by unconsciousness, swept through the congregation like wildfire. Soon, everyone was seizing or unconscious. The EMTs on site called for reinforcements, thinking it was a toxic inhalation from nearby industry. Soon, a parade of ambulances began dropping off patients in the ER, heading back for another load of unconscious patients. Upon examination of the patients, it was found they really weren't unconscious. They were just feigning the seizure/unconscious episode. We got about 40 patients from the mass hysteria event. but only saw about half of them before the other half got bored, and were miraculously healed prior to examination. Nothing was ever found as a potential cause. Story 23. Psychologist here. I had a patient with schizophrenia. Older gentleman, about 43 at the time. He was from Colombia and suffered river blindness when he was 15. Sometimes he couldn't distinguish his delusions from reality, which was especially difficult considering his favorite show was Ancient Aliens. When I was typing his progress notes, he thought I was typing his thoughts and trying to hospitalize him. It was difficult to reality check him, but he was impressively independent for a blind man. Story 24. I used to work in a children's home, and I had two girls who were very similar. One, she would go missing from care every night, would phone 999 claiming she had done XYZ, was wanting to end her own life, etc. Hospital would see nothing was wrong, send her home, and next day she would do it again. Hospital knew her on sight in the end. One time she said she thought her appendix had burst or something like that. My colleague, a trained technician with the ambulance service, asked if she had XYZ symptoms. She would go, "Oh yeah," and move her hand to that specific area. And colleague said, "There's nothing wrong with you." She never tried it with him again. She would also tell all the staff she was going to end them in a deadpan voice. She said it to me and I said, "Okay, can you wait till after my wedding though?" She never did it with me again because I didn't react how she wanted me to. And lastly, she claimed that she'd been assaulted by a stranger whilst on a missing person. Police took it very seriously because she went through with the report, until it became evident she literally had no idea what she was saying. 2. Girl was a pathological liar/delusional. She said she had 2 kids. She was 16 and didn't. She also said that her aunt and uncle adopted. She showed pictures and kids were spitting images of their parents. Said she was engaged. Said she was a professional ice skater before hurting her back. Made assault claims against a foster father, for which there was no evidence for. And therapists basically discovered that these events may have happened, but they happened to other people, not to her. She heard of these things and then applied them to herself and fully believed them. She was severely neglected as a child, and her mother was an absolute waste of oxygen, so she did it for attention. Both girls would also excessively self-harm in a competition with each other, as well as with another girl who was severely depressed and legitimately self-harmed. As soon as this girl moved into a different home, it stopped. The first girl would just slash her arms haphazardly in an attempt to make them more obvious, and would make the biggest fuss about them. Once had me wrap cellophane around her arm to stop her. The other was more genuine, and you could tell it was genuine self-harm because the cuts would be really small and she wouldn't make a big deal out of it. Story 25. I learned about a very interesting disorder that could explain a lot of mysterious disappearances. Dissociative fugue. It's a form of amnesia where basically you suddenly forget your entire life. Usually, you travel somewhere and just start a new identity, all without intention. There have been a few cases of missing persons being found years later under a new name with no memory of their past life, and some cases where they were missing for years only to suddenly remember their past life and reappear. It's usually caused by stress, not physical trauma. Story 26. Psychologist here. Not terribly wild, but the odd delusional disorder I've seen has been totally fascinating and a little terrifying. Picture a person that presents as entirely logical, rational with few or none of the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. They're expressive, engaging, good range of emotions. By all accounts, nothing is out of the ordinary, except they have developed a belief or system of beliefs involving persecution, grandiosity, or about their health or bodily functions. And they're bright and engaging enough that your initial thoughts are that it must be true what they're saying. Because of course they don't show up and say, "There's this thing I believe that can't be real." Instead, it demonstrates itself slowly as you explore, in these cases, some rather typical issues. I think it goes to show that the sort of implication that someone with a mental disorder or whatever can't be as smart or as charismatic as the average person just isn't true. For the majority of mental disorders, I would say, there's no effect on the personality of a person at all. Or I should say the base personality of a person. And that there's just some wires crossed up there that only show themselves when the opportunity presents itself. And I will say, as someone who used to be a psych major before switching over to theater, what a choice that was, but basically what I want to say is, it is very interesting to me. And I hope it's been interesting to you too. For now though, that is our last story. I hope you have a wonderful day or night wherever you are, and I will see you in the next one.